Hello and welcome to The Reset, a mental health podcast without all the bollocks. I'm Sam Delaney. My guest this week is the writer Johann Hari. All his life, Johann has struggled with his weight. After lockdown, he was, like many of us, carrying a few extra pounds and worrying what to do about it when a mate at a party introduced him to a new weight loss drug, Ozempic. And just over a year ago, Johann started to inject himself regularly with Ozempic and he saw immediate results, quickly losing several kilos. But he remained conflicted about this new drug. What impact might it have on him in the long term, both physically and mentally? We just don't know yet. Ozempic is just one of the new weight loss wonder drugs that some predict will be used by 1 in 4 Brits in a few years' time. Will it give us the freedom from weight and body image anxieties that plague so many of us, or will it create a whole new set of problems for our appearance-obsessed society? Johann went on a global tour to investigate these matters, speaking to experts and trying to work out the wrongs and rights of this new generation of drugs. The resulting book is called Magic Pill: The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs. This is Johann's second appearance on The Reset, and it's always a pleasure to catch up with this extremely smart and entertaining writer. I hope you enjoy listening to our chat. Johann Hari, welcome back to The Reset.
I'm well chuffed to be with you, Sam. I always get weird flashbacks whenever I talk to you because we did a TV show together. Literally, is it 20 years ago?
Yeah, it's fucking long.
It must be something like that,
wasn't it? Yeah, long time ago. And yeah, that was called Flipside. But yeah, we've known each other. And actually, there's a bit in your new book where you mentioned going to the Edinburgh Festival every year. And I remember bumping into you up there a couple of times as well. Anyway, we've known each other years. It's a delight to have you back on. It's a delight to read your latest book, as it always is. And I was just saying off air, it only seems like the other day we were talking about your last book. I mean, you know, this in itself, Johann, is it's a writing addiction. It's a productivity addiction, isn't it? I mean, my next book's about productivity addiction. This is something that you must have contemplated about yourself quite a lot, right?
I think it's because, I grew up in a family with a lot of addiction and it was quite a violent and mad environment. And the way I dealt with that was I would literally just sit in a corner and read and write, right? So my sisters often said to me, she was very envious of me when we were kids because she said it was like you had this ability to just exit the room by just reading and writing, right?
Yeah.
So I think, now this is not the way I would urge people to become productive, is to survive a violent and horrendous childhood, but it does give me the advantage that like my default mode is always to work. One of the only story I've ever heard that makes me slightly like Margaret Thatcher, who, as you know, I'm not a fan, is one time when she was Prime Minister, they were going to a summit in Portugal, I think, and one of her foreign ministers is there, and they go past a beach, and she says, "Malcolm, all those people on the beach, what are they doing?" And he says, "Well, Prime Minister, they're sunbathing." And she says, "Yes, but what do they do all day?" And she just couldn't get her head around the idea that you would just lie on a beach and do nothing, right? And that's the one and only area in which I am a Thatcherite. I'm like, can't just lie around and do nothing.
But yeah, and do you get like do you get jumpy? Do you get miserable if you feel like you haven't produced enough that particular day or week or whatever? I mean, as a writer, are you someone who has a word count that if you don't hit, you're, kicking yourself?
It's not that. For me, it's not. I don't have like a kind of marker of productivity that's as narrow as like, I've done 400 words a day or whatever. For me, it's more primal and pre-rational than that. It's more just you've got a limited amount of time in which to be alive. There's so many things you want to do. Did you today do some things that are a good use of your time? Right. It's more basic than that. If I ever have a day where I feel I wasted time, which doesn't happen very often, to be honest, but when it does, then I get really self-critical and antsy. So yeah, I've always had 3 or 4 projects I'm working on at the same time, and I always, on any one day, I want to feel that I've made some progress on one of them at least. But the advantage, it's obviously a great advantage to having work that you absolutely love and are really fascinated by. The advantages are obvious. It doesn't feel like work, but the disadvantage is it's very hard to know how to relax and decompress and not get burned out because yeah, so that's my kind of perennial problem is
Relaxation.
working to the point. Yeah, and just working to the point where your brain is just frazzled and it's not
Yeah.
actually productive to carry on working at that point, right? And to
Yeah.
then kind of go, okay, I'm going to absent myself from this. I can do it, but I've got better at it as I've got older, but that's a big challenge for me.
So, staying with you, I guess your childhood magic pill, the extraordinary benefits and disturbing risks of the new weight loss drugs is a fascinating, brilliant book. It's a lot about, weight loss and, your relationship with food is an interesting one that you described very entertainingly in the opening of the book when you're talking about your friendship with the wonderful sounding Hannah, who I was gutted as I was reading to have never met because you paint such a vivid and beautiful picture of her.
Well, I would have liked to.
But I sort of think to I just wanted to start out by saying, what role do you think, how do you think the relationship you had with food that you describe in the book, in which, you had, a love of, junk food, you binge ate, where do you think all of that came from? Was that linked into the same sort of things you talk about in your youth and escapism or what?
I thought a lot about this because I was trying to think about we're in this bizarre situation. 47% of Americans say they want to take these new weight loss drugs, right? And in Britain, we haven't got any polling on it, but I suspect it would be not much lower. And it's because of this totally unprecedented thing that's happened in our lifetimes. I think we're the same age, Sam. And, basically, the year we were born, I was born in, what year were you born? I was 1979.
No, 75, a bit older
Okay,
than me.
so in the year that I was born, 6% of British people were obese. It's now 26%, right? Between the year I was born and the year I turned 21, obesity doubled in the United States, and then severe obesity doubled again in the next 20 years, right? So it's a staggering rise that has never happened in the entire history of the human race, right? In fact, since you were born, the year you were born, 1975, in the whole world, obesity has tripled. So it's extraordinary. And weirdly, that has happened fast enough that it's shocking when you hear the statistics, but slowly enough that there wasn't that much friction around it. If anything, we blamed ourselves. You were like, oh, I don't have willpower, I'm not strong enough. But weirdly, the one place I can think of where there was a lot of friction about this and conflict about it was in my own family, which obviously must have played a role in setting me on the road to eventually taking these drugs and investigating them. So my parents are from very different places. They were both kind of runaways. My dad is from a tiny village in the Swiss mountains called Kandersteg, and he grew up in a food culture that was the healthiest food culture in the whole world at the time. I mean, a scientist literally judged this, the valley he lived in, the canton he lived in. So basically, where my dad grew up, there was no such thing as processed or ultra processed food. You only ever ate fresh food that you had grown or killed yourself, and you ate it on the day that it was either plucked or killed, right? Pretty much. My mum was from pretty much the opposite food culture. She's Scottish, the land that invented deep fried Mars bars. Working class Scottish culture when she was a kid was, ahead of its time. It was processed, fried, carby shit, basically, because they were knackered and they're working really hard and they don't have time to do all this shit, and they need some comfort. And my parents met in a nightclub off Carnaby Street in the 60s. My dad didn't speak a word of English, and my mother only spoke English. And they had what my mother calls a series of one-night stands, which I've tried to explain is not a concept that makes sense. And she got pregnant. They thought they had to get married. Really often she cries and says, he seemed so fucking nice when I couldn't understand what he was saying to me. But they had their first fight literally as a married couple, while they were signing the wedding registry, because she used her maiden name, and he said, no, you stupid bitch, your surname is Hari now. And she said, you can fuck off, you cunt. And they've been essentially screaming at each other the same way ever since. But one of the things they really fought over, among the infinite things they fight over, was how I ate, and me and my brother and sister ate. So I ate in a way that was kind of normal, probably the extreme end of the normal for London where I grew up, right? It was 80s, a lot of shitty processed fried food, carbs, sugary stuff. And the day we got a microwave was the happiest day of my grandmother's life, right? My mum's mum who lived with us. And to my dad, this was just, my dad was a cook as well. It was just horrific. It was like he would come home from a day cooking, and it was like he was watching me eat things that were not food at all, right?
Mm,
He was horrified. He said, "What the fuck is this shit?" It would enrage him. It was like he felt like he'd been catapulted out of a healthy food culture into some just bizarro world, right?
mm,
And I see now he had some important insights. He had no way to communicate them in a way that was comprehensible to a British child. You know, in the Swiss culture he'd grown up in, you didn't try and persuade children of anything. You just sort of screamed at them, and then if they didn't do it, you hit them, right? So it wasn't like a sane culture. So I could only interpret his advocacy of fresh food as a kind of assault, right? Especially since our school dinners were the shit that I was given. All my friends were eating similar shit. You know, you turn on the television and there were adverts for all this shit. So
mm,
it felt like he was a kind of Flintstones dad in a Jetsons age, right?
mm,
Um, but when I, what happened throughout our lives is basically the world flipped from eating the kind of food that my dad grew up eating to the kind of food that my mother grew up eating, and actually then much worse things than what my mother grew up eating. And that's had a really profound effect on us. And if we want to understand why people are turning to these weight loss drugs now, why they're so eager to get them, why there's this stampede for them, and it possibly one of the reasons why the drugs work, I think we have to think about that change. Because at first I was investigating what I thought were two separate questions. Why did we get so obese and therefore want the drugs? And how do the drugs work, right? But actually, the same word, when I was interviewing experts all over the world, from Reykjavik to Tokyo, in these two topics, the same word kept coming up. It's a word, not a word that we use that often in everyday English, but it's satiety, right? Satiety is the feeling that you've had enough. You don't want any more. We all had that with food sometimes, right? Or sex or whatever.
mm.
Or you're just like, no, I don't want any more. I'm happy, I'm sated. And what I learned is the food that we eat, this diet of processed and ultra processed food, profoundly undermines our satiety, right? It interferes with the signals that say, Sam, you've had enough, don't eat anymore. I can explain why and more about that if you like. But what these drugs do is they give you back your sense of satiety, right? In fact, one of the scientists who worked on them, Carel Leroux, a brilliant South African psychiatrist, said to me that what they do is they boost your satiety hormones, the parts of your body that make you feel full. So in that sense, as one scientist put it to me, Michael Lowe, they're an artificial solution to an artificial problem. The food supply fucked us. It undermined our ability to feel full. It led us to massively overeat. And then along come these drugs, which give you back this sense of satiety and this sense of fullness, but with their own risks obviously attached to them.
So that's really interesting. Is this you're referring to GLP-1?
Yes,
That is the so that's one of the things that makes us feel full, but when it's naturally processed in the body, it makes us feel full for a very short period. And with these new artificial drugs, we're basically having an artificially created version that makes us feel full for longer. But are you saying that that's actually as we should be? So all these drugs are taking us back to where we once were not that long ago as human beings?
No, I understand why it might seem like that, but I wouldn't put it like that. I think your summary is a good one. You've naturally produced GLP-1 in your body, which is your body's natural signal to stop eating. So if you started eating now, your pancreas would produce some GLP-1 and it would say, Sam, you've had enough, stop now. What these drugs do, exactly as you said, is they inject into you an artificial copy of GLP-1 or some other gut hormones, depending on which of the drugs it is, that stays around in your system for the whole week. So it has this strange effect on you. But bear in mind, it's an artificial copy of that hormone. It's not the real thing.
Yeah.
And it brings with it a whole other set of 12 significant risks that I write about in the book. But it's a very strange feeling when you take them. So I remember from the moment I heard about these drugs, I was incredibly conflicted about them for reasons we can explore. But I thought, okay, I want to explore this. I'm going to write a book about it. I'm going to go on this big journey. I've got to take them, or otherwise I can't really describe it. So I started taking Ozempic a bit over a year ago now. And I remember 2 days later, waking up in bed and having this really weird feeling. And I was trying to think, yeah, thing when you're just sort of coming around and thinking, what do I feel? Why do I feel strange? And I couldn't locate what the feeling was. And it took me about 5 minutes to realize I had woken up and I just wasn't hungry. I didn't want to eat anything.
Mm.
Like all my life up to that point, I'd wake up with like a really strong impulse to get out of bed to go and eat, right?
Mm.
Often I would be woken up by the feeling of my stomach rumbling. And I went to this cafe just up the road from here that I used to go to every morning. And I ordered the thing I would always order, which was a big brown bap with like loads of chicken and mayonnaise in it. And I had like 3 or 4 mouthfuls and I just felt full. I didn't want to eat anymore. And I remember when I left, Tatiana, the Brazilian woman who runs it, just sort of shouting after me, "Are you okay?" Because she was like,
Mm.
"Why has he left the food?" And then for lunch, I went to this Turkish restaurant next to my office. And again, I ordered the thing I would always order, which was Mediterranean lamb. I had a few mouthfuls. I just didn't want any more. It was bizarre. It was like shutters had come down on my appetite, and I was like 80% as hungry as I normally am. It was
Mm.
a genuinely bizarre sensation, and it just lasts. You know, sometimes it fluctuates a bit, but you feel very full very fast. Initially, it was thought because we knew GLP-1 was made in the gut. Initially, it was thought, oh, what these drugs are doing is primarily having an effect on the gut, right?
Mm.
And that was how the drugs were understood at first. Actually, from speaking to the scientists doing the cutting edge work on this, it's increasingly clear. We know that you have GLP-1 receptors not just in your gut, but in your brain. And it's increasingly clear, this is somewhat contested, but it's increasingly the balance of opinion is going more towards believing that actually these drugs primarily have an effect not on your gut, but on your brain. They change what you want and how you want them. And it does feel like that.
Mm.
Like it was bizarre to me to go, I mean, all the time you've known me, I've been a bit of a KFC addict and more than a bit of one. And I remember I took and just fast food generally, I remember I took my godsons into McDonald's, you know, a while after I started taking them and they got McDonald's and I just didn't want one. And I
Mm.
remember one of my godsons saying to me, "Who are you and what have you done with Johann Hari?" It's just like, this is bizarre, right?
Yeah.
So it's a very strange thing to have your food preferences changed by a drug is a very strange and in some ways positive, in some ways uncomfortable sensation.
Why were you so conflicted when you first heard about the drug? I mean, I'm conscious when I'm reading that about the fact that, you know, you've had addiction issues in your life. You wrote a whole book about the nature of addiction. Was that one of the big things that made you feel so conflicted when you heard about this wonder drug in a situation, by the way, and you'll notice when you read the book, listeners, that you know you were at a party surrounded by post-lockdown Hollywood types who all looked sort of even more beautiful and thin than ever before, and you found out it was as a result of this drug. So that's a
Yeah.
big temptation. Right? Well, I'll get on that. But where was the conflict coming from?
I could immediately see obvious benefits, right? I'm older than my grandfather ever got to be. He died when he was younger than I am now of a heart attack. My uncle died of a heart attack. My other uncle had such bad heart problems he needed a pacemaker. My dad had terrible heart problems. Um, so obviously I could see, and we know that sadly the scientific evidence is overwhelming that obesity massively increases your risk of heart disease, and in fact, over 200 other known diseases and complications from dementia to diabetes. So obviously something that massively reduces your weight, I could see the advantage. And we know with these drugs, the average person who takes Ozempic, Wegovy, loses 15% of their body weight in a year. With the next generation of the drugs up, Mounjaro, the average person loses 21%. And for the ones that are going to be available next year, Triple G, the average person loses 24% of their body weight, which is just below the level you get from bariatric surgery. Staggering.
Mm.
So
Mm.
I could obviously see the benefits from that, right, to my
Mm.
health. But I also thought, I mean, all sorts of things. I thought, well, I've heard this story before, right? Loads of times a new miracle diet drug has been announced, millions of people start taking it, and then it's found out to have some, you know, that you basically can't have a free lunch or an even smaller
Yeah.
free lunch, and that it has some horrendous effect, and they get pulled from the market. So I thought, okay, maybe that's going to happen. You need to really look into the risks of this. I also thought, well, we know why people got fat. It's not because of some biological malfunction in their bodies. It's because the way we eat completely changed.
Mm.
Surely the answer is to deal with that. I also thought, you know, what's going to happen to people with eating disorders? So I had so many like doubts. It's been a really weird thing researching this book, Sam. It's different to the previous books that we've talked about. So I went on this journey. I interviewed all these experts. I learned so much about the benefits and the risks and the cultural implications of what it's going to do to the culture. And at the end of it, I know much more than I knew at the start, but I'm still really conflicted.
Mm.
Like I've not got to the point now where I'm like, oh, and here's my settled conclusion, dear reader, and here are
Yeah.
the 5 things that we should do now. I mean, I hope the people who read it will be able to weigh the risks and benefits for themselves, but it is a strange feeling. The more you look at this subject, the more you realize how complex and strange it is. In a way, I found really fascinating, but disconcerting.
All these drugs, I mean, if we look at the modern type of antidepressant, the first, what, 20 years? I don't know what the scientists you speak to tell you, but, 20, people who take it for the first 20 years when they come on the market are effectively the guinea pigs, right? You don't know until it's been going on for, I mean, it's impossible to tell, really, isn't it? Until human beings have been taking this stuff for, a number of years in large numbers.
Yeah, that's true of all drugs. I mean, so what you've got to do is go in with an attitude of, okay, I'm going to weigh the risks of continuing with this problem, in this case, obesity, versus the risks of these drugs. And you can't get a perfect calculation because we don't know, as you say, we don't know the long-term effects. So what we can do is go in and look at some early things we do know. So bariatric surgery, people don't know, it's like stomach stapling, that kind of thing, gives us a good guide for some elements of this, because up to now, some people lose very dramatic amounts of weight very fast and keep it off through just diet and exercise, but it's actually shockingly rare. So the best research we have on what happens if you just very dramatically lose a lot of weight is from studying bariatric surgery. And it gives us some guidance for what the effects, for the likely health effects of these drugs. And they're pretty staggering, right? Bariatric surgery is a very grueling and unpleasant form of surgery, but once you get through it, in the 7 years that follow, you are 56% less likely to die of a heart attack. You're 60% less likely to die of cancer. You're 92% less likely to die of diabetes-related causes. In fact, it is so good for your health to lose lots of weight that you're 40% less likely to die of any cause at all. And the early research on these drugs is suggesting similar outcomes. So, for example, if you go in and you had a BMI higher than 27 and you start taking these drugs, your chance of having a heart attack or stroke goes down by 20% over the next few years, which is obviously very close to my heart, literally, not metaphorically, right? So we can see a lot of benefits to radical weight loss, which are just because obesity is so bad for you, right? Just the health effects of obesity are so extreme and so profound. But I also learned there are sort of 12 quite significant risks associated with these drugs that made me worried. In terms of the thing you bring up about long-term effects, so a lot of the scientists involved very reasonably say, actually, so far as drugs go, we have quite a long period of time of people using these drugs, because people have been taking these drugs to treat diabetes now for 18 years.
Right.
So in addition to having these effects on appetite, when you take a GLP-1 agonist like Ozempic, it catalyzes the creation of more insulin in your body, which is obviously what diabetics need. So diabetics have been taking it for a long time. So people like, for example, Daniel Drucker, who first discovered GLP-1, key figure in creating these drugs, said to me, if you're worried about safety, our knowledge isn't perfect, but you can say, we've had 18 years of diabetics using them. If there was some horrendous effect, it would have shown up by now. You can take some reassurance in that. And that's a good and powerful point. But against that, some other experts said, okay, let's dig into the diabetics. Let's see what happens to them. So, for example, there's a professor who I interviewed who's in France called Professor Jean-Luc Failly, who's at the University Hospital in Montpellier, who was commissioned by the French Medicines Agency to look into these drugs for them. So he starts investigating it, and France is the ideal place to do this research because they have really good medical databases. You basically can't opt out of them in France. So he started to look at diabetics who've been taking these drugs for a couple of years between 2006 and 2016. And he looked at loads of them, and then he compared them to a similar group of diabetics who had not taken these drugs to see is there any difference. And what he discovered is the diabetics who had taken the drugs, it appeared to increase any individual's risk of developing thyroid cancer by 50 to 75%, which sounds very shocking when you first hear it. He was looking at thyroid cancer in particular because we know when you give these drugs to rats, they're much more likely to get thyroid cancer, right? And when I spoke to Professor Faye, it's like, shit, that sounds really bad. He said, okay, you need to just understand a few things. He's not saying if you take these, if he's right, he's not saying your chance of getting thyroid cancer is 50 to 75%. If that was the case, they would pull the drugs immediately. What he's saying is, if he's correct, whatever your risk was at the start before you took the drug, that risk will be increased by 50 to 75%. So the risk is quite low. About 1.2% of people in their lives will get thyroid cancer, 82% of them survive. But nonetheless, it's a big increase in a relatively small risk, right? Now, this is disputed. Some people agree and some people don't. We'll know more over the next few years. But there's quite a lot of things like that associated with these drugs, which are sort of early flashing red lights that people are looking into. Now, again, you've got to weigh that against the risks of obesity. Dr. Shauna Levy, who's an expert on this, said to me, we don't know the long-term risks of these drugs. We do know the long-term risks of obesity. And these drugs would have to be really horrendous to counteract, to be as bad. Even think about cancer. Even if the worst predictions about thyroid cancer are right, and I suspect they are, they're probably still less than the risk of increased cancer risk just from being obese, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Cancer Research UK explain if you carry excess weight, and it doesn't have to be much excess weight, and it's quite shocking when I looked at it. When you carry excess weight, that fat doesn't just sit there, right? It's not inert. It sends signals through your body. And one of the signals it can send is for your cells to divide more rapidly, which can cause cancer. That's why cancer is one of the biggest causes of, that's why obesity is one of the biggest causes of cancer in Britain. So it's kind of maddening the more you look at it, how complex and weird it begins to seem.
You say in the book that I want to talk about the specific ways that you have found living with it over how long's it been since you've been
more than a year now, yeah.
Bit more than a year. Okay, so you say that you found your mood was strangely muted. I mean, was that temporary? Is that still the case? And what are the reasons for it, do you think?
So I had a weird experience when I'm in my friend Danielle's house at the moment, and she was pregnant the first 6 months I was taking the drug, and it was like we were on reverse trajectories. It's like I was every time I switched, it's like our bodies could fit
You're
together.
swapping weight.
Exactly. I was like, I had this sort of weird anti-pregnancy, and I remember saying to her one day, it was really weird. I was getting what I wanted, right? I lost a shitload of weight. I lost 3 stone.
Wow.
But it was really weird. For the first 6 months or so, I did not feel better. If anything, I felt slightly worse. And I couldn't really figure out what was going on. And I thought, I mean, maybe it's just a coincidence, right? Maybe there's other things going on in my life. And I realized there's sort of so there seemed to be a significant minority. I want to stress it is a minority if it's happening at all. But there seems to be a significant minority of people who are reporting similar problems. There's even some concern about potential suicide risk. It's why the FDA in the US requires a suicide risk warning on these drugs, although the European Medicines Agency hasn't. They're not persuaded by the evidence. So sort of 2 ways you could think about this. So some people think it might be to do with the fact that it's changing your brain, right? And it could be having effects in the brain. Let's park that. We can come back to it if you want. I suspect with me, it was a different thing. So a lot of people, of which I was definitely one, use food to manage their emotions, right? All through the writing of my book, I kept mistyping fried chicken as friend chicken. And I thought, oh, shit, you don't need to be Freud to figure that one out, right? And so a lot of people, when they feel down, when they feel anxious or whatever, just eat to silence those emotions and make themselves feel better. And I remember I had this weird moment, maybe 7 months into taking the drug. I was in Las Vegas because I'm writing a book about a series of crimes that are happening there. I've been working on it for a ridiculously long amount of time. And I went to this KFC that I always went to, because I'd had this horrendous day. I was investigating the murder of someone that I'd known, and it was awful. And I went to this KFC and I just really on autopilot, I went there and I ordered what I would have bought a year before. And I had this bucket of chicken sitting in front of me. And I suddenly thought, fuck, I can't eat this, right? Like I had a little bit of it. And I remember Colonel Sanders was on the wall and it was like he was looking down at me going, hey, what happened to my best customer, right? So one of the things that happens when you take these drugs is you cannot comfort eat. You just can't. You would literally, I mean, if I tried to eat a whole bucket of KFC, I would just vomit. I mean, I wouldn't want to. And if I did force myself, I would vomit. And I think one thing people need to be aware of if they think you're taking these drugs and there's a strong case for and a strong case against, is these drugs radically disrupt your eating patterns. And by doing that, they will bring to the surface all sorts of underlying psychological issues that you were playing out with food that you might not have realized were there.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
And it's not just comfort eating. There's a whole range of, I go through 5 different kind of psychological drivers of eating in the book. And I remember it was quite bad. And I remember coming to speak to one of my friends and saying, I don't want to do this anymore. I think I'm going to stop taking them. And she said to me, you can stop taking them if you want, but you should know these drugs aren't causing this issue. This issue was there all along. The drugs are just giving you an opportunity to deal with the issue in some healthier way. If you can learn to eat, to feed your body and make yourself healthy and learn to manage your emotions some other way, that obviously is the better option.
That's exactly the same process as coming off addiction to alcohol or drugs.
Yeah.
You come off it, you're physically better, but the next step is you're exposed fully for the first time to all the emotions that you were trying to hide from a long time. And when you talk about eating for comfort or eating for emotional reasons, that's something I hugely relate to. That's been my approach to eating since I was a child, and it still is to a large extent. So when you say, and actually, because I don't take drugs or drink alcohol anymore, it's probably more significant than it once was, because I'm out of other things to distract myself with. So what I've tried to do is just learn to just manage my emotions and get to grips with things better. But there is still a part of me that will demolish a, jumbo chocolate bar when I've had a stressful day, right? And take that away. And I think your analysis sounds really convincing to me. It's like you're taking that away. It's one less thing you have to protect yourself from bad feelings that you've always tried to run from. But ultimately, that's a good thing, isn't it? I mean, if you can no longer use food for those reasons, it's going to push you towards coping with them in more in healthier ways.
I think it can, but there's a big if in the premise of what you're saying. I totally agree with you, Sam, but there's if you can find a better way to deal with it, right? And as we know, with lots of forms of addiction, I think about the person I was talking about who was murdered in Vegas was a big gambling addict. And when he couldn't gamble, he was suicidally unhappy, right? So, of course, there's the third option, which is dealing with the issues that are making him both gamble or be suicidally unhappy. But that's a leap for a lot of people that they never get to, right? So, all addiction is an attempt to solve a problem, right? Tommy, my friend who was killed, gambling was the best solution he had to his underlying distress. Now, it's not a good solution for all the obvious reasons, right? Just like heroin, overeating, none of these things are good solutions. But getting people from the risky solution to the good solution is a very difficult job to manage. And if you fall down the middle of the crack, if you fall into the crack between those two things, the risky solution and the bad solution, if you fall into the crack of no solution at all, then that can be very risky. I think there's other things, psychological things that go on with these drugs that I think are related to what you're asking. So some of them are, it's very interesting. If you look at bariatric surgery, again, best comparison we have for many of the aspects of these drugs. So with bariatric surgery, most people have bariatric surgery are very pleased, their health improves, but the suicide risk for people almost quadruples after bariatric surgery. It's really interesting. Now, some of that I think it's a really physically onerous thing, and it's, it might be the physical complications make people miserable. But I also think, one of the scientists who worked with bariatric surgery patients said to me, a lot of people imagine my life is shit now. If only I was thin, it would be good.
Yeah.
And then you lose all this weight, you've got your dream, and your husband's still an asshole, and you've still got a job you hate. And suddenly it's almost like, oh shit, this isn't the solution I thought it would be, right? So I think there's all sorts of interesting psychological things that go on there that are complicated and difficult. And in a way, it relates to the title of the book, because the book is called Magic Pill, right? Because there's 3 ways these drugs could be magic. The first way is the most obvious, which is they could just solve the problem, right? They're just something that, and there are moments taking this drug where it absolutely feels like that. You're like, wow, I used to eat a fuck ton, and once a week I do a tiny little scratch into my leg, and now I don't want to eat very much. Like, it just feels like magic, right? So there's one way it could be a rapid and extremely effective solution to the problem. The second way it could be a magic trick is it could be a con, right? It could be, we all know how magic illusions work, right? It could be appear to give you this benefit, but actually fuck you over in some other way. That's conceivable. The third way it could be magic, and I suspect this is actually the most plausible, is if you think about all the kind of classic stories of magic, like Aladdin or Fantasia or whatever, you get what you wished for, but you get it in a way you never imagined at the start, right? And the magic starts to run away from you in ways you couldn't have predicted, right? And this is going to have all sorts of really weird and unpredictable effects on the society. I mean, Barclays Bank commissioned this very sober-minded financial analyst, Emily Field, to look into the financial implications for investment of these drugs. And she came back and said, if you want a comparison, you've got to look at the invention of the smartphone in 2007, right? We're about to be in a situation where we're going to live in a society, particularly if the price comes down, that is a big if, but I think it will happen, where weight is going to be much more under people's control than it has been ever. And that is going to play out in all sorts of strange and unpredictable ways, I think.
My last questions are, first of all, do you still enjoy food?
I want to stress the answer to this, I'm very unusual, right? So most people who take these drugs say it significantly diminishes their pleasure in food. Jens Jules Holst, who's one of the scientists who developed these drugs, said in an interview with Wired magazine that this was a huge problem and that most people taking it just find eating so miserable that they just give up after a while. So Jay Rayner, who I think you probably know, the food critic for The Observer, he wrote about taking Ozempic and it would just killed his pleasure in food and going to the best restaurants in Paris and just being miserable, right? I did not have that experience. So for me, I realized taking these drugs how much what I got from food, the purpose of eating for me was largely to physically stuff myself. It wasn't actually about tasting food. It was to get that sensation of being stuffed, right? Feeling when stuffing is where you eat beyond the point of being full and you feel like a pressure outward on your stomach and upward on your esophagus. And I think that was what drove my eating. I was trying to get that feeling, right? And what happened when I started taking these drugs is you can't do that. So I remember going out for dinner with one of my friends and her saying to me, actually, it's always been a bit weird going out to eat with you because you eat so much so quickly, but you don't seem to really enjoy it. And she said, now you eat so much more slowly. You do actually look like you're tasting your food, right? So I don't want to overstate this. I'm not a foodie. My pleasure in food is limited, but I actually think I take more pleasure in food now than I did before, admittedly starting from a very low base. So maybe if you pictured Jay Rayner was someone who just took enormous amounts of pleasure from food, it was a big driver of his life. And I was someone who got basically no pleasure from food. So he's come down and I've come up. But yeah, I think I don't want to act like I'm typical in that respect. I am.
Do you eat enough? I mean, is there a risk that, you say some people might just give up because they just find it boring, and then that presents its own myriad health risks?
Yeah, one of the 12 big risks that I write about in the book is malnutrition. So, for example, one of my relatives started taking these drugs not long after me, and I was really alarmed because she just wasn't eating, and her kids were having to remind her to eat because she was eating so little. It's a big problem. You've got to get the dose right, and if you get the dose too high, you get malnutrition. I mean, it really can dial down your appetite rapidly. Also, and this is one of probably my biggest concern out of all of them, certainly one of the top 2 or 3, is we know there are some people who want to kill their appetites. There's lots of people with eating disorders that actually hugely increased during the pandemic. It was already very high. And there's already evidence that young women, it's disproportionately young women, or some men, are getting hold of these drugs to really deliberately kill their appetites. And that is horrifying, right? That is really worrying. And we should be immediately acting. The most important thing we should do on that is, at the moment, anyone can get these drugs on Zoom, right?
Yeah.
And they're meant to check your BMI, but how are they doing that on Zoom? It's not. They didn't even bother trying when I first got them. So I think I agree with the experts who are saying these drugs should only be prescribed in person, and they should be by doctors who have a training in spotting eating disorders. It's not perfect, but it would be a lot better than what we have now.
I did a story recently about a spate of young men who are very into fitness culture, overtrain, and often undereat. In boxing, it's a huge problem. Have you looked at that? Like people who exercise a lot, are there any athletes taking this? I mean, you need a lot of food if you're training a lot, don't you?
I would have thought, I've not heard about that happening, and I would have thought it's because it would be counterproductive. Because my understanding, and as you know, I know literally nothing about sports, so please feel free to correct me. But my understanding is to do any of those things, you have to have a very high calorie intake to build
Yes.
muscle. I think it would be really counterproductive because
Yeah.
you just literally physically couldn't consume enough.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is a lot of guys, become obsessed with building muscle and losing fat, and they might think
Right.
this is a shortcut to losing fat, but I suppose it's another
Well, but that's
interesting.
another. I suspect they wouldn't want to do it because what we do know is one of the other 12 big risks of these drugs is loss of muscle mass. So
Right.
people are reporting huge loss of muscle mass. It
Okay.
varies. I actually weirdly had no loss of muscle mass at all, but I think that's because I essentially had no muscle mass at the start. But yeah, one of the things we know is this causes a lot of muscle mass loss. So I'd be very surprised if sports people who were,
Right.
if they tried it,
But
they would quickly back away.
that's really interesting because I mean, losing muscle mass brings with it, especially as you get older, a huge amount of health risks as well,
Massive
doesn't it?
problems. So there's a
Yeah.
possibility here, and this is particularly an issue for people who are using the drug who were already slim and are using it to be super slim, but
Yeah.
actually across the board. So any form of weight loss can cause muscle mass loss. For people who don't know, obviously muscle mass is the amount of soft tissue in
Mm.
your body that you need to be able to like climb the stairs, lift anything up, whatever it might be. And you naturally lose muscle mass as you age anyway. But people who are going into aging with very low muscle mass as a result of taking these drugs could be building up all sorts of problems like sarcopenia, which is a condition which a lot of people have as they age, where basically you're just very weak, you can't climb the stairs, that
Mm.
kind of thing. So we could be building up a potential time bomb of people who, when they're older, will be significantly more frail and significantly physically weaker. That's one thing. It's one of the many things I'm worried about in relation to these drugs.
My last question is,
Ah,
if it's working for you, you're slimmer, you look great, right?
oh,
You do, and you must get a buzz. People must tell you that, and it's working for you, and for you, and I think you in the book and here today, you've been very clear about how, just because it hasn't affected you in certain negative ways, that doesn't necessarily mean it won't others. But how long? Once you're on it, how long are you going to stay on it? I mean, do we know if you gain weight quickly when you come off it? What's the story there?
yes. If you stop taking it, you regain most of the weight within a year. For most people, not everyone, but the vast majority of people. So it's basically like statins or blood pressure medication. It works as long as you take it, and it stops working when you stop taking it, which brings a whole set of concerns, obviously. One is you've got to take it basically forever. It seems to. Now, take that with a pinch of salt. The drug companies have a vested interest in telling us that because obviously they want you to buy it forever. Some people are reporting, it seems to be a minority, but it's not nobody, that if you stop, provided you've made some changes, you can keep the weight loss off. But they seem to be a minority. So for me, you know, I feel very agonized about this, but it tells you something about my appreciation of the risks and benefits. Obviously, I'm going into it with a family that got a lot of heart problems, so my calculation will be different to other people's. I'm going to carry on taking it for the foreseeable future, but with a lot of worries. I mean, you mentioned long-term risks. One of the people who's working on the drugs, Greg Stanwood, who's at Florida State University, said something kind of chilling to me. He talked to me about, if you look at the 1950s, right? In the 1950s, doctors started giving people antipsychotics, and it was judged at the time that they were safe. But 30, 40 years down the line, they discovered something that just couldn't have been known at the start, which is that if you give people antipsychotics when they're in their 20s, 30s, 40s, they're much more likely to develop Alzheimer's disease and dementia later in life, like much more likely. Now, I want to be clear, he's not saying he thinks these drugs will have that effect. He's just saying,
Yeah.
we don't know, right?
Yeah.
And it's obviously better to not take a drug if you don't have to, because we don't know the long-term effects. So against that, you do have to weigh the risk that I'm pretty sure I would have carried on being obese if I hadn't taken these drugs. So it's complicated, it's difficult, but yeah, we also don't know if your body will develop tolerance to them and the effect will wear off, right?
Yes.
We don't know that. So, I mean, the diabetics appear to not be getting tolerance. They don't need higher and higher doses. So but it might affect obesity differently to how it affects diabetics. So it's very complicated, but one of the things I was kind of sobered by all along is how high the stakes are. This is the biggest preventable killer of people in Britain, right? It's the biggest cause of blindness in Britain. It's the biggest cause of, leg amputation in Britain. It's the biggest cause of just people being fucking miserable in Britain. I mean, that would be harder to measure, but it certainly would be one of them, right?
And the strain on the NHS, the cost of the NHS is huge. I mean, this could be this could revolutionise what's happening in the NHS.
I mean, if you just think about what we already know about these drugs, that they reduce your heart attack and stroke risk by 20%. If you can generalize that across the entire population in a country like this, where most people are overweight or obese, I mean, that's just staggering. That would be a staggering transformation, right? That would save, a conservative estimate, hundreds of thousands of lives. So there's a big prize here potentially, but there are big risks. It's complicated, and I think everyone will have to weigh those risks and benefits very carefully for themselves. For me, my kind of ultimate conclusion, but I wouldn't put much weight on this because it's not like a certain feeling. If it was someone I love asking my advice, at this point, if you have a BMI lower than 27, I would say definitely don't take them. You're incurring all the risks like muscle mass loss for no benefit. You weren't obese or overweight, right? If your BMI is higher than 35 and you don't have thyroid cancer in your family and you're not trying to get pregnant, that's another risk we didn't talk about, I would personally, if it's someone I love, recommend they take the drugs, because the risk of being that obese is so high that I think it would outweigh my concerns about the risks of the drugs. If your BMI is between 27 and 35, which I suspect is you, that's where I was, then I think it's much more ambiguous and it's not clear. And I would say go down the list of the risks, go down the risks of the benefits, think through the psychological issues you have about food, think through all sorts of things that might be going on here, and sort of make your best judgment. But we don't really know is the honest answer.
Wow. It's really fascinating. The book is brilliant, and I wish you all the best of it. It's a huge subject, and I think the book's going to be another big hit for you. Johann, thanks so much for your time.
What a pleasure. Cheers, Sam. And I should have meant to say on my publisher's Taser Me, if you want to know where to get the audiobook, the ebook, or the physical book, you can go to magicpillbook.com. But also, they tell me to say you can buy it in all good bookshops, but the truth is you can buy it in shit bookshops as well. We don't have like a quality test. It's not like you cannot stock this book, you fucker. You're
willing to let anyone sell it, and that's as it should be. But I will put the links to the site and everything else you need to know about purchasing this book in the show notes with this episode. So you're all good there. Johann Hari, you're a legend. Thanks so much for your time. That was Johann Hari. His new book, Magic Pill, The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs, is out now. I can highly recommend it. It's a fascinating and really page-turning read, and I'll put a link to buy it in the show notes. That's it for this week, gang. As always, thanks for listening. Please subscribe to The Reset if you don't already at samdelaney.substack.com. You could upgrade to paid for just $5 a month. You get bonus content, newsletters, the full archive of pods, and early access to all the content too without any ads on it. Until next time, be lucky and don't let the dickheads get you down.